Hey guys, welcome to Mintcast, the official podcast of Mint Press News. I'm your host, Benar Mohawish, founder and editor-in-chief of Mint Press News. Today we have a really important show, possibly one of the most important episodes we've had on this podcast so far, with a very special guest, Whitney Webb. She's going to join us as we dive deep into the many conflict of interests at play in managing the coronavirus pandemic, its response, cure, and everything in between. Today, we have state and corruption-ridden companies and billionaires that are capitalizing on the public's fear to rake in record profits, change laws, and uproot entire societies, while building the groundwork for a dystopian, authoritarian police state straight out of George Orwell's 1984. And of course, the mainstream corporate media is not even talking about it. We are talking today about Jared Kushner, Bill Gates, vaccine companies tied to the opioid epidemic, martial law, the death of our civil liberties, expanded mass surveillance states, and, I could really go on, but today our guest, Whitney Webb, is much better suited in breaking these down for us. You're probably familiar with Whitney from her extraordinary work at Mint Press as a staff writer and investigative reporter for the past few years. She's now a contributor and is working on her first book about Jeffrey Epstein and his ties to the deep state. Whitney, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Now, you recently published a series of reports on the last American vagabond titled Engineering Contagion, Amerithrax, Coronavirus, and the Rise of the Biotech Industrial Complex. You've gone deeper than any other journalist has that I've seen in exposing the agenda of the national security state, Silicon Valley tech giants, billionaires, big pharma, you name it, basically preparing for over a decade for a flu-like pandemic like coronavirus, and how they'll be capitalizing on the crisis to fulfill an Orwellian vision. Now, there's obviously a lot to unpack here. It was like a 3-part series, I believe, so far, but I'd like to start from the very beginning. In your series, you explain for decades the U.S. biodefense programs and pandemic preparedness efforts are now rearing its ugly head as pandemic panic distracts the American and global public from the fundamentally untrustworthy and frankly dangerous individuals who are in control of the U.S. government and corporate America's response. And that was a quote from your series. Who exactly are these individuals and institutions that you were referring to, and what exactly is their agenda?
All right, so the pandemic preparedness efforts that I'm referring to are really these simulations that took place last year. There's actually another one that I learned about after my series started, but I haven't reported on that one yet. But the ones that I focus on, one is called Crimson Contagion, which is a series of simulations. It wasn't just one simulation. It was 4 simulations that took place over the course of January of last year through August, involved 19 different U.S. federal agencies, 12 states, and I think over 30 private companies, corporations. And they were all simulating a pandemic influenza outbreak that originated in China. And the person that led that exercise and basically outlined it in its scope and all of that is a man named Robert Kadlec, who is the current HHS Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response. And then the other simulation that I'll be talking about is in the series is Event 201, which is out of all of these simulations has definitely gotten the most attention. And I'm specifically focusing on one of the main groups that hosted that exercise, which is the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. And the director of that center is a man named Thomas Inglesby, who is essentially the moderator at Event 201. And the reason why I point out Inglesby and Kadlec as being significant is because both of these men and the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security as an organization, they were fundamentally very involved in this very disturbing simulation that took place in June 2001 that is called Dark Winter. And Dark Winter is very disconcerting, in my opinion, because it, as I said earlier, it took place in June 2001, but it eerily predicted the entire narrative that would follow 9/11 and the 2001 anthrax attacks. And participants in Dark Winter had foreknowledge of those attacks, in the time between the September 11th attacks and the first anthrax attacks taking place. They were, some of them were telling people in the Bush administration to take Cipro, the antibiotic that prevents anthrax infection. And were, basically seeding the media with this narrative that there was going to be an anthrax attack. And then a lot of these same individuals, including Cadlick and Inglesby, were involved in the FBI investigation or in efforts to basically cover up what was really going on with the anthrax investigation. Because if people remember back, there was a major effort to blame the anthrax attacks on a foreign source, specifically Saddam Hussein, working hand in glove with Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, which is the very narrative put forth in Dark Winter that says that those two, that Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden would work together to do, a bioterrorist attack in the United States. That was the narrative that was put out about these anthrax attacks by these very people, but then it turned out to actually have originated from a U.S. military bioweapons lab. And the FBI investigation, which was called the Amerithrax case, was just an enormous cover-up. And, people say, oh, well, maybe it may not have been a cover-up, but I disagree with that on so many counts. But I would, direct people to the most obvious point of evidence for that being the fact that the lead investigator for the FBI on that case ended up filing a whistleblower lawsuit and leaving the bureau because he said it was a cover-up and that he was obstructed from investigating the case by his higher-ups. But there's a lot more there. And so these people's involvement in Dark Winter, and now they were running these simulations last year for either a coronavirus pandemic in the case of Event 201 or pandemic influenza originating from China in the case of Crimson Contagion. A lot of the things they planned out in terms of solution and response, we have seen so much of it come to fruition as this coronavirus case takes place. And a lot of other people that were involved in Dark Winter are also involved in different aspects of what's going on with coronavirus right now, whether that's advising Bill Gates and his foundation, or whether that's being on the board of directors of some of these companies that are set to profit from the coronavirus panic, really, specifically in the vaccine market.
So there's clearly a lot of, conflict of interests taking place right now in terms of management, response, and tying it to the 9/11 response. Who are some of, you mentioned Bill Gates, you mentioned some of the foundations. Who else is involved? And talk to me about some of the hawkish think tanks that are involved.
Do you mean involved currently with coronavirus or with the anthrax case?
With both, because you mentioned that they were kind of tied together.
Right. Well, the people that did Crimson Contagion and Event 201 had ties to this Dark Winter scenario. So Robert Cadlick, who's now the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response in Dark Winter, the title of the Dark Winter exercise actually comes from a quote that he said in one of these fake fictional news clips they use in the exercise, where he's, appears on that and says it will be a very dark winter for America and things like that. So he was involved in the creation of the script for that exercise. And then later on, immediately after 9/11, he became a Homeland Security advisor to Dick Cheney in the realm of bioterror and bioweapons. And what's interesting is that right after 9/11, the co-authors of Dark Winter, including Thomas Inglesby, who was the moderator at Event 201, personally briefed Dick Cheney on the Dark Winter exercise. And apparently Dick Cheney was very interested in a lot of things that transpired. And at this point, Dick Cheney had already been told by another Dark Winter participant, a man named Jerome Hauer, who at the time of 9/11 was many things, but also a national security advisor to the Department of Health and Human Services, had already told Cheney's office and other Bush administration officials to take Cipro to prevent anthrax infection. So there is a lot of very odd things that went on in that window of time between 9/11 and the first anthrax attacks being known to the public, which was around October 4th, 2001. So also in this period of time, you had people like Jerome Hauer, who I just mentioned, going on mainstream media saying that there was going to be an anthrax attack by the same people responsible for 9/11. So Jerome Hauer was doing this, but so were members of Project for a New American Century, including former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, who was also a participant in Dark Winter. were going around saying that there was going to be a biological weapons attack. You had Richard Pearl, you had Donald Kagan, all of these PNAC neoconservatives saying that there was going to be a biological weapons attack by the same people that did 9/11. And even though I mentioned that it was actually a U.S. military source, the anthrax that was used in the attacks, if you actually look at pictures of the text on these anthrax letters that were sent out during the attacks, they say 9/11, 2001, death to America, death to Israel, Allah is great. There was a deliberate effort to frame the perpetrator of the anthrax attacks as being tied to the 9/11 attacks and being a Muslim, right? And that actually turned out not to be the case. But there was, this effort that was preceded in this exercise to paint it as such. And there was, this foreknowledge of these people saying, seeding this idea in the American public consciousness while also privately taking, Cipro to prevent anthrax for themselves, but not warning postal workers, for example, who ended up handling these letters. Some of them ended up dying. They didn't warn any of those people, right? But they were taking it for themselves. And there's a lot more red flags about the anthrax case, and specifically what the FBI did in the early days of the investigation. It's just, very disconcerting to see that sort of narrative here. And speaking of the anthrax attacks as well, it's worth pointing out that currently we're seeing this effort with coronavirus to say that the current pandemic is caused by a Chinese bioweapon. And the origin of that claim comes from a lot of the same people that tried to say that the anthrax attacks were the work of Saddam Hussein. And I say this because in early January of this year, one of the first stories to circulate this claim that the coronavirus originated from a bioweapons lab in China came from a man that used to work for Israeli military intelligence named Danny Shoham. And he had previously said, actually written at least one or two academic papers arguing that the anthrax attacks were committed by Iraq and Saddam Hussein. He is arguably the first person besides Radio Free Asia, which is U.S. state funded. But Shoham was quoted in the Washington Examiner earlier this year saying that coronavirus is a Chinese bioweapon. And of course, you have a lot of people that used to be on Project for a New American Century, which I just mentioned earlier, and is sort of seeding this narrative about the anthrax attacks before they took place. They have a lot of those members are now on this new think tank called Committee on the Present Danger China that is also really, heavily boosting the same narrative that people like Danny Shoham have been bringing up. And people have really been buying into it, seemingly forgetting that a lot of these same people are the guys that told us that, Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11 and basically pushed us into a big war. And now they're doing this with China, which is, a totally different ballgame than Iraq in terms of war on a huge scale. I mean, China has nuclear weapons. They have the largest army in terms of the number of servicemen in the world. I mean, this is no joke, but the fact that so many people are buying this hook, line, and sinker, including people that, greatly criticize PNAC and the Bush administration for lying us into Iraq, they seem to be really willing to swallow this narrative now, even though it's coming from the same people.
Well, that is a lot to process, I think, for most people, because, the connections you made between the anthrax attacks and the cover-up that took place afterwards, is new, still new information to a lot of people. So how, in terms of a lot of this, China bioweapons, allegations that are taking place that are coming from the same people, we're not hearing any sort of watchdog style criticism from mainstream media like CNN and the New York Times. In fact, they are spreading so much fear in terms of, the coronavirus and how we should be responding and social distancing, which, to a certain point, we can understand, because I think, you and I, Whitney, we're taking coronavirus seriously. You can still be in that category to take it seriously, but then also be concerned about, impending economic devastation. You could still be worried about the expansion of an authoritarian government policies under the guise of coronavirus. You can be all of those things, but the media is only pushing one narrative. So how is the media working to play out this, China is the new Russia narrative and fear-mongering while the government is building the framework of something bigger and greater that should really fear us or scare us?
Well, Right. So what's interesting is that in these pandemic simulations, whether it's Dark Winter or the ones that took place last year, they place a lot of emphasis on the media. And actually, Dark Winter had 4 participants that were from the media, including Judith Miller, who later went on to heavily promote Saddam Hussein is responsible for anthrax and help lie us into Iraq. And so last year at Event 201, they talked about the need to control the narrative. And basically clamp down on or increase online censorship of what they call our unverified claims, or claims that go against the official narrative. And this is important in terms of amplifying these Chinese bioweapons claims as well, because when you look at what happened with Iraq, right, the reporting specifically regarding anthrax in Iraq was just atrocious and literally just made up of all these basically made up intelligence and just very poor reporting. If you were, as an example, there was this ABC News report, for example, after the anthrax attacks, not long after, where they said that the anthrax used in the attacks contained bentonite, and that bentonite was used in in Iraq's previous bioweapons program that the U.S. sponsored, by the way, in the 1980s. And that the bentonite being in the anthrax samples meant that Iraq must have been responsible. But it later came out that none of the anthrax tested ever had any bentonite at all. It was completely made up. And that ABC News report cited what they said, 3 well-placed sources, which later became 4 well-placed sources. And those sources were never revealed, and that story was never redacted, even though it was proven entirely false. Now we're seeing a lot of news reports start to emerge that are very similar. For example, the Washington Post and Fox News recently reported that the coronavirus did emerge from a Wuhan lab. And they are, using very similar language to suggest that's the case. For example, Fox News said that their reason for making that very bold claim was because they had been informed by sources that had been briefed about China's early actions as the coronavirus, first began to spread around Wuhan. And, that language is, people should really scrutinize that, because it doesn't even say government officials. It doesn't say who did the briefing, if these sources were even briefed by government or intelligence. It could have been members of a think tank briefing members of another think tank, or, anything like that. I mean, it's just very vague, and that's the only evidence they're citing. But they're citing, this lack of evidence, but making these big headlines, and then it's being amplified by mainstream media in a very similar way to what we've seen in the past with the lead up to Iraq, or other policies or regime change efforts that the U.S. wants to promote. I mean, mass media in the U.S. so frequently amplifies this, and it's very rare that mainstream media in the U.S. actually opposes U.S. regime change efforts or U.S. wars. I think Alan McLeod actually did an article about how there were a few, if any, U.S. newspapers and Western newspapers that actually opposed or were even neutral on U.S. efforts to promote regime change in Venezuela, right? So, I mean, this is something that's been going on for a very long time, but we're seeing it now in the age of coronavirus, where people are in a state of panic, and there's a state of chaos, very similar to what happened in 9/11, which ended up leading to a war that killed millions of people and is still, maiming Iraqi children, and killed a lot of U.S. soldiers. And it was just a disaster by all accounts, right? So, these same people and the same media, machine is basically putting us on a very similar path. And I think people really need to start being wary of it and start calling it out.
Well, and the media is also, pushing, the cure, right? They're pushing the idea that we need to take a vaccine to cure the coronavirus. And so, speaking of media, talk to me about the vaccine companies who are set to supposedly cure us from COVID-19 and why we should all be concerned.
Okay, so there's several vaccine candidates right now. So there's several companies that are aiming to basically get the first government approval for the vaccine. But because there's going to be such widespread demand and there's talks of a mandatory vaccination program, it's very possible that there's more than one vaccine that ends up being used, just because of the amount of vaccine that can be produced in a certain amount of time by a certain company may not be enough to meet immediate demand, for example. So it's basically a race towards government approval. It's not really a race towards a cure. And I say this because they've suspended a lot of normal testing procedures, clinical trials, things like that. For example, they skipped animal testing on some of these vaccines, have gone straight to human testing. And, that can cause major safety problems potentially, because we're not going to know even a lot of the medium term, arguably some of the short term side effects, and obviously not long term side effects that these vaccines may have. It's worth pointing out that two of the vaccine candidates, the one being developed by Inovio Pharmaceuticals and the one being developed by Moderna Inc. Both of these companies are strategic partners of DARPA, by the way. They are both developing vaccines that are a category of vaccine that has never been approved for human use ever in the United States. And this is because, most vaccines that we know of today, they use damaged parts of the virus. Some even have live virus in them, right? But these vaccines are different because they don't have either of those. What they have are foreign genetic material. Moderna's is a messenger RNA vaccine. Inovio's is a DNA vaccine. These are both vaccine technologies that were actually developed by the U.S. military arm DARPA that I just mentioned a second ago. And they have never been approved for human use. It's very disconcerting that this type of vaccine technology that's never been approved for use in humans before is basically being rushed through, skipping animal trials and all of that stuff, especially when their attempts at making vaccine candidates in the past, like Zika, for example, failed spectacularly. But, because of the panic and fear and the demand for a vaccine, it's being pushed through. So sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so another company that's doing this too is Johnson & Johnson. They've gotten a lot of U.S. government money from HHS's BARDA, which is one of these relics of the Bush-era biodefense program. They've gotten a lot of money to develop their vaccine specifically. Johnson & Johnson, in addition to participating in last year's Event 201, also has a very scandalous history of putting asbestos in baby powder and knowing about it and lying about it and still selling it anyway. Even though we know of the horrible health effects of asbestos and putting it in a baby product nonetheless, right? So these are the people that we're supposed to trust to make the vaccine. And another company that I point out in part 2 of my series in this engineering contagion series is one called Emergent Biosolutions. Jerome Hauer, who I mentioned a little bit ago in connection with Dark Winter and the anthrax attacks, he's been on the board of directors of this company for a very long time. They have long had a very controversial monopoly on the anthrax vaccine that I point out in connection with the anthrax attacks, how they were about to lose their contract for the anthrax vaccine with the Pentagon in August 2001. And of course, the anthrax attacks that followed soon after that reversed all of that completely because of the panic and the chaos, similar to what we're seeing now. They also cornered the market for the only smallpox vaccine in the United States, which is been a focus of post 9/11 biodefense preparedness, which is basically the mass stockpiling of vaccines, as opposed to, storing up a protective equipment for health workers and, developing surge capacity for hospitals. All of that was ignored in lieu of stockpiling vaccines, which of course has been a huge boon for a lot of these pharmaceutical companies. But anyway, this other company that I'm talking about right now, Emergent Biosolutions, which used to be called Bioport, by the way, they have also recently cornered the market for the only opioid overdose antagonist, which basically reverses. So, if someone's suffering from an opioid overdose, you give them this nasal spray called Narcan, and it helps revive them. And keeps them from dying from the overdose, right? So this company has a monopoly on that. And they have prevented generic competitors from coming in to lower the price. Their CEO has talked about U.S. colleges and high schools being untapped markets for Narcan, basically saying, not looking at it as the huge public health crisis it is, but as, an economic boon to the company, the fact that there's so many overdoses among young people in the U.S., it's honestly just very sick. So anyway, they are now on the road to, they're backing 2 vaccine candidates for COVID-19, and they're also backing 2 experimental plasma blood treatments. And one of those is being fast-tracked by HHS by Robert Kadlec, who I mentioned, by the way, has ties with Jerome Hauer going back to Dark Winter and all of this. And Robert Kadlec now is the guy that approves which vaccine companies get the millions of dollars from that department's BARDA program. And so he's been giving it to companies like Johnson & Johnson, Emergent Biosolutions, all of these companies. It has ties to this biodefense industrial complex that Cadlick has been a part of for a very long time, including people that he, was involved with at the Dark Winter exercise.
And what's so interesting about everything that you mentioned, if we were to post these random facts, which are facts, by the way, on social media, we will get tagged, flagged, whatever, for conspiracy, fake news. It'll hit the Facebook fake news meter. But everything you mentioned is literally on these big pharmaceuticals websites. These are things that have been reported on in mainstream media as well. Yet it's so taboo to talk about vaccines, so taboo to talk about the ingredients. I mean, I follow another individual who covers the ingredients on vaccines. Literally all she does is just post the ingredients on vaccines, and she covers the autoimmune response to these ingredients. And she has continuously received, she's a researcher, by the way, with a PhD on this subject. She continuously receives messages to remove these posts. And so I appreciate you reporting on this and talking about this, but the media won't necessarily talk about the connections being made and how important this is, because this really should raise many red flags for many people, yet it's so taboo to talk about vaccines. But speaking of vaccines, what the media will give attention to is Bill Gates' infamous TED Talk from a few years ago called The Next Outbreak, which has literally been replayed like a million times on mainstream media. He's made media appearances as an expert on the topic of the response, the cure. He's not even a doctor. He's a billionaire who's, rose to the top through philanthropy. But there's also been a huge backlash from the public on social media. He was trending a couple of weeks ago. People don't want, mass public doesn't seem to trust Bill Gates. What has his role been in shaping government response? And is the public outrage justified, Whitney?
Well, I think it's kind of naive for people that trust Bill Gates to think that someone who was one of the most ruthless CEOs in the tech world all of a sudden became super concerned about public health and charity as soon as he opened up his charitable foundation. I think that's honestly kind of odd, but I haven't written extensively on Gates specifically, but he is one of the major funders of the World Health Organization. He is a major funder of numerous other organizations, including the Gavi Vaccine Alliance, which brings together, pharmaceutical companies and these charitable foundations like his and some other funding sources. He also backs the Coalition for Epidemic Innovation, sorry, I can't remember the full name, but it's CEPI. Which has been giving a lot of money to these pharmaceutical companies to develop vaccines for coronavirus right now, but previously other diseases like Marburg virus and Ebola, and things of that nature. He has been kicked out of countries like India, his foundation has, because of the close ties between his foundation and, pharmaceutical companies, that they've considered that to be a conflict of interest, that he has conflicts of interest in promoting vaccines as the cornerstone of, global health policy, as opposed to, other, alternatives that wouldn't necessarily benefit, big pharmaceutical companies so directly, right? This is worth pointing out because there are some cases that are very concerning, I would argue, in current, like World Health Organization vaccine policy. For example, the use of the polio vaccine. In the US, there's a type of polio vaccine that is used, but it's not the same that is used in the developing world. The one that is used in the developing world, including in Chile, where I live, and in Africa and a lot of other places, is the oral polio vaccine, which contains live polio virus. The one in the US does not contain live polio virus. Okay, so this vaccine that's being used and promoted by WHO, in developing countries, has actually at this point ended up causing so many polio cases that now cases that are caused by this oral live polio vaccine are causing more cases of polio than polio that is occurring naturally in the wild. So it's obviously like not helping at this point, but these pharmaceutical companies have incentives that they want to keep selling their product because they continuously produce these vaccines and they stockpile them. And if there is a policy put in place because a vaccine is considered damaging or found to have adverse effects, oftentimes instead of just saying, all right, we have to move to something else, they seek to market those stockpiles to developing countries. or other countries that have not restricted that vaccine, despite knowing that adverse effects have been detected, right? And so this polio vaccine is one example of that. There are several other examples of that. And of course, the Gates Foundation has also been, sort of embroiled in controversy as well about with the tetanus vaccine in 2014, a couple health associations, including one that was associated with the Catholic Church and another one that's associated, like one of the major associations of doctors in Kenya. They sent samples of a tetanus vaccine to a lab to be analyzed, and they found that it had presence of this hormone that's necessary for pregnancy in women there, which had previously been contained in anti-fertility vaccines that were sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation, another charitable foundation, and the World Health Organization in the past, in I think the mid-90s. And there was a huge cover-up of this, and Kenya's government was actually getting economic incentives from the World Health Organization, which, by the way, as I mentioned, is largely funded by Bill Gates. And there was a study that was funded and produced by another organization that was founded and funded by Gates Foundation to basically claim that, the presence of this hormone in there was not bad. But actually, I mean, there are also studies that show that when you this vaccine had previously been produced that had this hormone in it to prevent pregnancy, because you have this hormone in there and you have the adjuvant. So you basically end up developing antibodies to that hormone. So if a woman gets pregnant and naturally starts to produce that hormone, it becomes attacked and pregnancy is no longer viable, right? So basically the cover up of that whole situation in Kenya, it was funded by two organizations that are direct, that their main two, in both cases, most of their funding comes from the Bill Gates Foundation. And this hasn't been talked about in mainstream media. It's been dismissed, like you said, as a conspiracy theory. Actually, one of the heads of one of these Kenyan doctor associations ended up being targeted by Kenya's government, which had, conflicts of interest. As I said, they had economic incentives to keep this vaccination program going, and things like that. And mainstream media was not very critical of what was going on. And it was actually undercovered in alternative media as well. This was several years ago. And honestly, it hasn't really been given enough scrutiny. And also another thing that I've brought up a couple times, I've talked about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal a lot. Over the past several years, Bill Gates had very close ties with Jeffrey Epstein. They were largely focused around science. There's been a huge cover-up of their ties. They go back to the 1990s, but the New York Times, at least, officially claims they only go back to 2011. But regardless, even mainstream media admits that the backup executor on Epstein's will was the former top science advisor to the Bill Gates Foundation, a guy named Boris Nikolic, and that Bill Gates and Epstein had numerous meetings, and Epstein or Gates was giving a bunch of money for Epstein for him to use for quote unquote charitable purposes. Mainstream media has also admitted that Epstein's main scientific interest was eugenics, right? So the fact that, there's all this stuff in the back with Epstein or with Bill Gates and conflict of interest with the pharmaceutical industry. There's also this other side of, why was he hanging out with someone like Jeffrey Epstein who was interested in eugenics? And actually, if you go back and you look at, the history of the eugenics movement in the United States, which goes back to actually the 19th century, it was very prominent up until World War II, but a lot of that same ideology persisted after World War II in different ways. It was really heavily promoted by the Rockefeller brothers during that period of time. And I would encourage people to look at that, because even though it hasn't been so public, there's been sort of this same very toxic ideology that has guided some, members of the billionaire class for a long time. And, I think Bill Gates deserves scrutiny in that regard, because some of his past statements where he says things a couple years ago saying like, my greatest worry is that there's too many young people in Africa, for example, and people need to have smaller families, and he has 3 kids, it just seems kind of odd, some of his rhetoric, and people have been pointing this out. And now we're seeing mainstream media sort of run interference for Bill Gates, saying, oh no, he's being attacked by online mobs, and things like that,
Poor guy, right?
Yeah, I know.
And didn't he also say that he wouldn't vaccinate his kids?
So I had thought that because I had been sent that by a friend of mine, and there was a report that was claiming that his doctor, or the doctor that saw his kids when they were really young, that Gates had declined to vaccinate them while they were young, but did not know if they had been vaccinated when they were older children or adults or whatever. But I wasn't able to independently verify that from that report. So I'm, treating it as unconfirmed.
Yeah,
no, we don't know. So I went on, Tim Dillon's show a week or two or a couple days ago and mentioned that. And it turned out that couldn't be confirmed. So I sort of had to issue a correction on that. So I got to be so we really need to be cognizant that there's a lot of claims that are going around that are that seem likely but are unconfirmed. But there are definite facts and definite red flags in Gates' past of philanthropy, right? And his ties to pharmaceutical companies and how, he's used his foundation and his billions of dollars to basically, have a stranglehold grip on global health policy, not just in the U.S. or at the UN through the World Health Organization, but in countries around the world.
Well, what really concerns me is, as you mentioned, how the vaccines can be different in the United States versus in third world countries. Today, if we look at countries like Yemen or Somalia, who are living under the bootstrap of U.S. imperialism and NATO warfare, these foreign countries are, these nations are pillaging Yemen and Somalia for their resources. They have people, it's a man-made crisis. The famine there is all man-made. Everything is man-made. These areas are rife with disease. It's because of U.S. imperialism, and Yemen is a very good example of an illegal U.S. Saudi-backed blockade that's preventing food and medicine from entering the country. And now these countries could face not only a famine pandemic or, epidemic, but now they could be facing a coronavirus pandemic in their countries, in addition to what they're already facing. And if a vaccine goes there, it raises questions as to, will this vaccine be used as a weapon of war to make things worse for these people? Because I don't think that the United States or Saudi Arabia wants to see the Yemeni people be healthy. They're literally the ones who are ensuring that they're starving.
Right.
There are over 23 million people starving there because of U.S. imperialism. I mean, our politicians are okaying this policy. There's no criticism of it, with the exception of maybe like Rand Paul and like Bernie Sanders. But even they don't go as far to say that, this entire policy is inhumane and we need to get all U.S. troops out and just end the blockade completely. And so that really concerns me. Having covered Yemen and famine, in the Horn of Africa. Speaking of Bill Gates and, just Dr. Fauci's recent statements about, we may never be shaking hands ever again. I mean, what benefit do these people have? What benefit does the establishment have in creating this, I don't want to say the word, the phrase New World Order, but what benefit did they have in creating this order where people are not shaking hands, we're not interacting like we used to be? Is this really what we are expecting society to look like? And if so, what benefit does this have for those in power?
Well, I think this is about introducing what, we heard a couple of times, the new normal, that this is all becoming the new normal. It's social engineering on a massive scale. I think this huge push towards social distancing has a couple different motives behind it. One is the introduction of AI-driven, contactless, humanless technologies, where people will be interacting more with machines face-to-face instead of people, which has been a long-standing agenda that I talk about in my most recent report that is a big part of what Silicon Valley and the CIA and the Pentagon want to come about, is the mass adoption of AI technologies. They were saying this at least, over a year really before the current pandemic took place, right? And I think another major factor is the fact they don't want protests anymore. Before coronavirus hit, there were numerous countries around the world that saw, people-driven movements trying to overthrow governments. And thanks to coronavirus, a lot of those protests are, they're pretty much gone now because of social distancing, lockdowns, quarantine orders, things of that nature, right? And what's interesting is a lot of the first countries to do lockdowns did so even before, in Chile's case, where I live, they announced a lockdown before there was even a single death from coronavirus. And I would argue that's because since last October, there have been massive protests against Chile's current president. And by introducing that order, those protests that were starting up again in early March ended up stopping, right? So it wasn't just Chile that did that. Also, France was one of the first countries to do a lockdown that ended up getting the yellow vest movement off the streets. Spain followed France shortly thereafter. That stopped a lot of the protest of the Catalonia separatists. And then, you had some other cases as well beyond those countries. But I think it's kind of interesting that a lot of these countries that were the first to do lockdowns also had some of these popular protest movements. And what's interesting, too, is that a lot of the so-called response or relief measures for coronavirus that have been put in place under any other circumstance where there was not, this type of lockdown scenario would have generated major protests. For example, this so-called relief bill that ended up giving $4 trillion to Wall Street. That's 4 times bigger than the 2008 Wall Street bailouts. And of course, after those bailouts, there were the Occupy Wall Street protests. There was a lot of anger towards Wall Street. But now there's all these, enforcement orders about social distancing and lockdown. Some countries have tried to sort of, or some people in countries with lockdown have tried to protest anyway, despite social distancing. Recently in Israel, there were some protests against Netanyahu where the protesters stayed like 6 feet apart from each other and took to the streets anyway.
That was really interesting to see.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I think there are a couple ulterior motives here. One is sort of to remake the economy in a way that a lot of these oligarchs have been planning for a long time, because we've been hearing about for years of some of these, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, for one, wanting to replace a lot of workers in Amazon warehouses with robots, things like that, right? So this sort of what's going on now with the economy has given them a lot of opportunity to do that. And I think it's very interesting that we have, what I mentioned in my latest report, this National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, basically laying out the roadmap for how to basically force American society to adopt artificial intelligence technologies. And there's a lot of overlap between that commission and with Trump's new, what he's calling the Great Economic Revival Industry Groups, which are basically a private sector task force. There's one task force for each sector of the American economy that will be advising the White House on what to do. And you have people like you have some of the same people that are on that commission that laid out that roadmap on these task force, like Safra Catz of Oracle. But you also have people that have promoted AI in the workforce, like Jeff Bezos. You also have Elon Musk on there, and a lot of Trump's top billionaire donors like Sheldon Adelson, Bernard Marcus, you have Paul Singer. It's basically the oligarch class that's deciding how to reopen up the economy and giving them unprecedented power and influence on how to do so, whereas the American public doesn't really have much of a say. And the last time oligarchs had a huge say over what happened to the economy in this way, we saw the mass outsourcing of U.S. industry to China, for example. And that, of course, was done because it doesn't cost as much to pay a worker in China as it does to pay a worker in the United States doing the same task, right? So it was cheaper. But what's even cheaper than paying someone in China or Bangladesh or Vietnam or whatever is paying a robot, because you don't actually have to pay them. You just pay the upfront to install the AI system and the robots and all of this. And then you don't have to pay them ever again, because they don't eat and they don't sleep. And they don't have families and they don't pay rent, So to think that these billionaires, that some of whom have openly made plans for this, now that they're on these task forces, what do you think they'll do as they, help create these government plans to reopen the economy? I really think we won't be ever returning to normal. And they keep using this phrase like, this is a new normal. You have to get used to it, so that, people just consent to it and accept it, while at the same time preventing protests over people that resist AI. In this document, this roadmap I talk about that basically came out last year, they talk about how the American perception of AI is a major obstacle to the adoption of these AI driven technologies, because Americans distrust how it will affect their privacy. They distrust that it will cause a loss of jobs. And they say, in contrast, the Chinese government and the Chinese media paint, artificial intelligence as a tool to ensure global leadership in the technology sector. And that's what the U.S. wants. The U.S. doesn't want the U.S. national security state and Silicon Valley, which are come together in this commission that wrote this roadmap, they have huge concerns about China dominating artificial intelligence technologies. And they say that if we don't adopt those technologies on a massive scale like China is doing, we will fall behind and we will no longer be able to set the rule book or the international norms or even export AI technology to other countries. And we will basically the U.S. will lose its position of hegemony entirely to China over the next several years, which obviously for them they consider to be a huge national security threat. So it's just all very disturbing, honestly. But I think those are the factors.
But $1,200 check to each individual will make us all shut up, right?
Yeah, I guess. I that's what they're assuming, and I think it's just very troubling because a lot of Americans can barely survive on that. I think Steve Mnuchin, the Secretary of Treasury, that participated, by the way, in this Crimson Contagion thing. By the way, the the Treasury Department was there. They developed like a whole day on their last exercise just to finance responses during a major pandemic crisis last August, right? But anyway, Mnuchin thinks Americans can survive on $1,200 check for 10 weeks. I mean, that is just that's not insane. Grounded in reality for a lot of Americans.
Survive. Yeah, no, I mean, you need at least like $3,000 for like one individual, probably at least
right.
to pay for rent or a mortgage, groceries. I mean, groceries are so expensive now in America. Daycare costs if you have kids, if you're a single mom, if you have somebody dealing with mental health issues. I mean, it is insanely expensive to survive in this country. It's not like it used to be.
Well, I think this is part of the strategy, too, is to not have people comfortable with the lockdown, like barely scraping by with, this $1,200 check for 10 weeks, keep people uncomfortable and increasingly desperate to the point where they'll take whatever scraps the oligarchs or the government decides to throw at people. I think that, by and large seems to be kind of the strategy here to try and get Americans to accept, these oligarchs trying to revolutionize the economy in a way they normally wouldn't accept. If they're, in a desperate situation to stay in their houses and stay clothed and feed their families, people will accept things they normally wouldn't accept if they were comfortable and were able to maintain their regular standard of living.
I just can't believe that we're having this conversation now because
I know.
Everything just sounds so futuristic, but in fact, it's actually happening right now in 2020. So something that, people aren't, I've been following a lot of people online, and it's like people are on like two opposite sides of the spectrum. It's like they're taking social distancing very seriously. They're taking coronavirus very seriously. They are taking every word from Trump, the Trump administration, the WHO, everything so seriously. And they say openly, these people, that they don't care about their First Amendment rights. They don't care about their civil liberties. They don't care about the Constitution right now. Right now, we have to practice social distancing, and that is it. And then you have people on the other side who are like, this is all a hoax. Our civil liberties are being trampled on, et cetera, et cetera. It's like the two opposite extremes. And how do we come in the middle to recognize that, sure, we can take coronavirus seriously, but care about our civil liberties and Constitution, and look at, and call out, you very briefly mentioned, Jared Kushner's plan for far-reaching mass surveillance. I mean, I think this is one of the things that we should really talk about and kind of wrap up the conversation with is, how do we find a middle ground while also bringing attention to this plan that's being led by Jared Kushner, that will give us a mass surveillance system that will build the groundwork for an authoritarian state far greater and far worse than we ever expected from our government. At least most people would say that is like the 9/11 plan on steroids. I hope my question made sense. I know that was a lot.
Yeah, well, there were two parts to it. So first off, in terms of finding middle ground, I think this is why it is so important for independent media right now to do what they do, because I think it's really up to us to show people on both extremes where middle ground can be found and how important it is right now to bridge, whether it's the two-party divide or the divide on people's opinion about what coronavirus is and how severe it is and all of that. There are some points that I think people on, regardless of what side of those issues they fall on, can agree about. And the second part of your question you brought up, I think, is one of the ways to show people that, which would be this Jared Kushner coronavirus surveillance system, as well as some of the things that William Barr, the Attorney General, the head of the Department of Justice, has been fielding as a way to respond to coronavirus. And I say this because the Jared Kushner promoted surveillance program, as well as Bill Barr's recent call to get new emergency powers that would involve the indefinite detention of Americans. Both of these policies were being directly promoted by the same people, though in the case of the surveillance system, it was actually Jared Kushner's wife, Ivanka Trump, that was promoting it last year. But last fall, both of these policies were being very heavily promoted, but not as a response to a global health crisis, but as a response to mass shootings in the United States. Okay, so the fact that we're supposed to believe that solutions that were being fielded as a response to mass shootings are going to be the same solutions that we need to respond to a pandemic. I mean, if you think about it, you step back and you think about it, that logically doesn't make a lot of sense. How the solution to mass shootings is the same as the mass solution is the same solution as what we need to do to combat coronavirus or something like that, right? It doesn't make logical sense. And I would argue this is because what they are trying to do is that these solutions are things that the national security state, that, in these cases, Bill Barr and Kushner and Ivanka are representing. These are solutions they've wanted to implement for a long time in the post 9/11 era, but have not been able to get enough consent among the American public for their imposition thus far. And so they have spent the past several months and years attempting to justify the imposition of these policies based on whatever Americans are most afraid of at the time. So last fall and last October, when a lot of this stuff was going live or being promoted, people were most afraid of mass shootings. And that was what was being, hyped in the media, what we need to be afraid of. And now, of course, it's coronavirus. So they're basically tacking on whatever justification they can to justify this type of solution. And of course, before mass shootings or before coronavirus, it was terrorism, the war on terrorism. They're basically just shifting the boogeyman, but the solution remains the constant, right? And really quick, I want to talk about what the surveillance system entails and how it compares to the one last year. So, okay. So basically what the Kushner promoted surveillance system wants to do, it's about, they say it's about contact tracing for coronavirus using location data, as well as combining that with Americans' private health data and data that's stored on consumer smartphones. And the system last year that was being promoted by Ivanka and some other people called for the creation of a new government agency called HARPA, and its flagship program was to be called Safe Home. And Safe Home was about using private healthcare data and private smartphone data and everything you've ever said on social media, combing through it and then using artificial intelligence to analyze and determine who may have mental health issues, and then flag them for, mental health treatment or, a range of responses. Okay. And at the same time, William Barr was promoting a pre-crime program that actually exists now that is called the Disruption and Early Engagement Program. That was, he announced that last October as a way to respond to mass shootings. And it would be using the same system of digging through the same information, these same databases, in order to identify people that are, quote unquote, mobilizing towards violence. And he said that what would be done with the people who were flagged in that program would be court-ordered mental health treatment, indefinite house arrest, or indefinite detention, right? And so a lot of those same emergency powers is what Bill Barr just asked for a few weeks ago under the guise of responding to coronavirus, right? So basically the same mass surveillance system that, was HARPA and Safe Home and all of that is the one that Kushner is now seeking to build right now with companies that have direct ties to Google. One of the main companies that's set to build this is their lead investor is Google Ventures, which is Google's venture capital arm. And, a couple of the other ones have direct tie, are already U.S. military and intelligence contractors and things like that. So not really surprising to see those companies on there. But what is concerning is that there is already evidence in other countries that have implemented these quote unquote contact tracing applications is that they actually hinder the response to combating the pandemic. And so, as an example, the first country to implement this type of surveillance was Israel, and it was managed, or it's still managed, by Shin Bet, which is, Israel's domestic intelligence agency that is sort of like the FBI in the U.S. And not long after it was implemented, an association of Israeli doctors came forward and said, actually, this is hampering and hindering our ability to respond to coronavirus, because this app, the data it is collecting, does not help us at all. It is not the data we need. And instead of Shin Bet saying, okay, well, we'll tweak the program so it can give you the data you need, they didn't change anything at all, because the fact of the matter is this is something that benefits them, not the coronavirus pandemic. And as I said earlier, this is something national security states in the US and Israel and other countries that are similar, around the world, that they want to implement to help control their own populace. In Israel's case, these types of surveillance programs have long been used in Palestine, but now they're being used in Israel at large. And maybe, some Israeli citizens are surprised, but I mean, that's essentially what's happening. And we're going to see the same thing, attempts to implement the same thing here. But since we've already seen in countries that have used this app that it's not actually helping the coronavirus response, it's still being promoted anyway. And I would argue that's because it's something that the government wants to do, and it doesn't want to do it for public health reasons. And I think, this is an example of a point that needs to be made to help people reach this middle ground and see that, there are key policies that are being promoted that are not about the virus, that are about control. And that, people that are concerned about, that take coronavirus seriously, and people that don't, can agree on this point.
Right. And I think that pretty much sums up everything that you've, talked about in this conversation, is that it really is about control and not about actually helping citizens in the coronavirus response, which, it's another reason why it's so important to turn to independent media. Because, we're not just parroting the same lines from, the national security state in promoting these things. We have to question, we have to ask why, we have to advocate for ourselves, because sure as hell the mainstream media is not advocating for us. They're taking an extreme stance, and in fact, they have become, and they are, the propagandists for these entities. So Whitney, thank you so much for joining us today. That was a lot of really, really great information. I learned so much from you. I always learn so much when I read your articles and investigations. So that's a wrap for today's Mintcast podcast. This program is 100% listener supported. You can join the hundreds of financial sponsors who make this show possible by becoming a member on our Patreon page. We'll see you next week. Thank you.